Australian Stories. Hey X, this is the first time I've come to this board, and I have 3 Australian stories to share. I normally do not share my stories with anyone except for close friends and family because, to be honest, they make me sound like an absolute crackpot. A friend of mine urged me to post here, as it allows me to remain anonymous, and this community seems, perhaps too, open-minded. Before I start with the stories, I will give a bit of a background on myself. I am a 29-year-old guy living on the Gold Coast in Queensland, Australia. For those that may know the area, I grew up just outside of Rathdowney on a 600-acre property which has been in my family since the area was first colonized by Europeans. I moved to the Gold Coast when I was 20 to allow my fiancée, now my wife, to further her career in finance. My skill set was mostly limited to aquaponics, maintenance, and fish care, which I found was next to useless in the city. So I turned my attention to my true passions, writing and fishing. I was soon picked up by one of Australia's largest fishing magazines, which led me on countless fishing trips around the country. It was on these trips that these stories occurred, and also the reason I've taken the screen name of Aussie Fish Journo for these posts. I drink alcohol and smoke cigarettes, but I was not drunk during the events that happened in these stories, and I do not take any recreational or prescription drugs. The first story that I will share with you happened in 2009 in northeastern NSW. I was doing an article on the recently rehabilitated Clarence River cod, also known as the Eastern Freshwater cod, in the area, and basically had a week to travel an entire river system by kayak and tag as many cod as I could. This trip was purposefully correlated with a full moon on the last night, as it would provide the best conditions for targeting cod with surface lures throughout the night. For anyone who may be interested, the trip itself was, for all intents and purposes, a complete failure, as I only managed to catch 4 cod in total, all neonatal and tagged from a previous restocking program. However, it was the occurrence on the last night of the trip that I will be sharing with you. I keep a tight journal on all of these trips, as it allows me to add personal and anecdotal insight when writing articles, as well as ensuring that I do not forget to include any important details or events. This is, word for word, but only including pertinent details, a copy of what I wrote in my journal that night. With a tally of 8 bass, 2 tendons, a spangled perch, and a foul hook deal, today was another codless day. The entire camping area above the falls was taken by a cavalcade of caravans, and I settled for a small patch of cleared shrubbery below the falls, but far enough away that I would not be in danger of flooding, and so that the crashing water would not keep me awake. 3 curlew birds entered camp shortly after I was set up, and I offered them some cooked perch, but they would not take it, even after I threw it well out of arm's reach. Odd to see them in this area. Moonrise tonight will occur around midnight, and I will do my best to wake up and throw surface lures at every eddy I can find. Conditions are still comfortable but cold. No clouds or rain. Water is flowing reasonably hard over the falls, but the depth is significantly lower than it was 4 months ago. That was the final entry for the trip, as the next morning, I was in no mind to write down the following events. Again, I will try to keep it as concise as possible, but without missing important details. I woke up to my watch's alarm at 11:30 p.m. without worry and made the short walk to the base of the falls. Moonrise was still at least a half an hour away, but I decided to have a few exploratory casts, mostly just to try to warm up, as the temperature was around the 4°C mark. On the 4th or 5th cast, I managed to snag up on something near the other side of the creek. Instead of shining my light over the creek and ruining my chances of catching a fish over the next half an hour, I decided to wait for the moon to rise, so I could see where it was stuck and retrieve it the following morning. I sat down and had a cigarette and tried to stay warm. I considered going back to camp, but I knew this was my last decent chance to tag a few cod, so I decided to sit there and shiver until the moon rose. What happened next is a classic cliche. As it was long after summer, the roar of the cicadas was not present, but insects, frogs, and other nocturnal animals created a much quieter, but, in my opinion, much prettier symphony that would fill the night air. Just as the first rays of light from the moonrise had come over the falls and illuminated the creek, I noticed that the faunal noises were non-existent. The only sound present was that of the running water, and I sat there with a certain curious suspiciousness. It is a hard feeling to explain, one where something just feels off, but you cannot figure out what it is. I was feeling pretty spooked, and decided that it was not worth hanging around for a $15 lure, so I grabbed my rod and was ready to make my way back to camp. I took one last look at the falls, and that is when I saw it. There was a large, thin object at the top of the falls, illuminated by the moon. It was definitely not there during the day, and my first thought is that it was a large tree or huge group of branches that had been washed down the river overnight. And then it stood up. This thing was between 6 and 8 meters tall, incredibly thin and very human-like in shape, with arms much longer than a human has. I am by no means an artist, but I have attached a picture here of what it looked like in the moonlight. It slowly raised its arms into the air, as though it was reaching to the moon itself, and that's when I noticed 2 of the same creatures standing beside it. I'm not sure if they were there the whole time. I did not notice, because I was fixated on the one in the center, or if they appeared as it raised its arms. All 3 of these things had their arms raised into the air for a few seconds, before completely vanishing. It took me a second to realize that they had disappeared, because their silhouette against the moonlight was that strong. It had made an imprint on my sight, similar to when you look at the sun and see sunspots in your vision for a few seconds after. This next part was by far the most disconcerting event of the night. Anyone who has ever been out in a thunderstorm at night will know how surreal it is when a bolt of lightning illuminates the world around you for a split second. For that minute amount of time, you can see everything in a bright white light, almost as though a giant spotlight has been cast upon you. Well, a few seconds after the things vanished, the moon had just made its way completely over the top of the falls, and suddenly, it was like daytime. For 4 or 5 seconds, I could see everything around me in a strange white light, similar to the lightning effect I just mentioned, but lasting long enough that I could look around the entire area. I forgot the picture in my previous post, so I attached it here. The only real detail I managed to notice over this period of light was 3 curlews standing together on a small platform near the base of the falls about 20 meters away from my position. I think the only reason my brain recognized that they were there was because they stood out so well against the water and rock face behind them. And just like that, the light was gone. The bush once again only lit up by the moonlight. I stood there in shock of everything I had just seen for at least 5 seconds before a long, whistling sound jolted me back to reality. The song of the curlews. For anyone who does not know how the curlews sound, click this link. It's quite a spooky call at the best of times, and, given the situation, was way too much for me. I dropped my rod and raced back to camp, scrounged every piece of wood I could find in the immediate area, and built the fire up as large as I could. Well, that's basically it for that story. Nothing else eventful happened. I retrieved my rod, but not my lure, the next morning, traveled downriver, and got picked up via 4x4 around 11 a.m., as was previously planned. In hindsight, I wish I had spoke to the caravanners camped above the falls to see if they saw anything that night. I later did a little bit of research and found that large, thin humanoids play a large part in the Aboriginal culture from all over the country, often in the form of things like quinkins. This was my first experience with how weird the Australian bush can be, and in all honesty, I stayed away from remote places for quite a while afterwards. However, in the next story that I'll tell, I found that odd things can happen in quite populated areas too. This next story happened on one of the many Moreton Bay Islands in southeast Queensland. I normally will be happy to divulge the locations of where my stories have occurred, but in this case I was asked by the locals, one person in particular, not to tell anyone which exact island it was. I will say that it is in the southern part of Moreton Bay and has an expanse of mudflats. The Moreton Bay region has quite a history, along with some well-entrenched folklore. Everything from leper colonies to escaped convicts becoming cannibals and many wars between Aboriginals and European settlers. It is a relatively high populated area and borders Queensland's capital city of Brisbane. I was here to get some photos for an article about fishing with bait on inshore shallow reefs and hoped that I'd be able to cast net a large amount of bait fish, such as pike, mullet, garfish, and whitling, for bait rigging photos. This particular area was largely unfamiliar to me, but I decided my best bet of catching bait would be to spotlight the mudflats and mangrove areas on the 10 p.m. high tide. I was being helped by an older bloke who had just started a charter boat business in Moreton Bay, and I had promised to give him some free advertising in the magazine if he could get me onto some good fish the following morning. We headed down to the flats around 9 p.m. and began wading through the murky waters, both with a cast net in our hand and a cigarette in our mouth. This is fairly customary in this part of the world, as it is the only surefire way of guaranteeing the mosquitoes and midges stay well away from your face. We were both wearing strongly powered headlamps around the 1000 lumen mark, which were only turned on a few seconds before throwing the net. Otherwise, you risk spooking the fish. The rest of the time we were in the darkness, out 100 meters from the shore in knee-deep water. Your mind tells you that every rock you step on is a stonefish, and every piece of seagrass that touches your leg is a bull shark that's come in to check out its net feed. So, it's a bit of an adrenaline rush. From memory, we were doing quite well within the first half an hour and had 20 or so garfish and a few pike, both perfect snapper baits. We decided to head back to the shore to roll a few more cigarettes and put our captured fish into an esky in the back of my ute. We were almost back, about 30 meters away, when my friend said, "There's someone at the ute." I looked up and could just make out a faint shadow of what looked to be somebody crouched down near the back of my ute. This was not totally odd, as there is a permanent population of 120 or so people on the island, but the fact that they were snooping around in the darkness made me very suspicious. My friend and I whispered about what to do, and we decided that we would walk through the water as quietly as possible until we were about 10 meters away from the ute. Then we'd hit it with our headlamps at full power and ask this person exactly what they thought they were doing, prowling around our car in the middle of the night. I carry a multi-tool on my belt at all times when I'm fishing, mostly to dispatch fish and cut line. In this case, it was my Leverman Surge, which is a reasonably sized built-in knife, and although I had no intention or expectation about using it, having it with me did make me feel a little bit better about confronting our prowler. Well, we got around 10 meters away from my ute, and I patted my friend on the shoulder to signal, "Let's do it." Both headlamps came on, fully illuminating a 20 meters area right around the vehicle. What was staring back at us was shocking. This prowler was certainly not human. Standing on two legs about 140 centimeters high, it seemed to be covered in either dense hair or a very heavy coating of mud. In an instant, it turned towards us, let out a yelp, very similar to a noise made by a dog in pain, and took off into the mangrove trees, which bordered the east of the mud flats. Its movements were not a run or a walk. It seemed to glide or hover straight towards the mangroves and disappeared into them as soon as it reached the tree line. I only caught a split-second look at its face, but it did not seem ape-like, as is often the case in Yowie and Bigfoot stories, but more like a dog but with less of a snout. Quite hard to explain, and definitely too hard for me to draw. Its eyes were hugely reflective. It was almost like the light from our headlamps had hit two small mirrors and were directed back at us. We were both, understandably, quite shocked from the incident and threw our gear into the back of the ute and drove to the most well-lit part of the island, a small grassy park near the pub. We did not check for prints or anything in the area as, honestly, we just wanted to get the hell out of there. The next night we quietly and almost embarrassedly asked the bartender if there were any wild dogs or similar animals on the island, hoping for a rather menial explanation for the prowler that we had encountered. His facial expression formed what would best be explained as a wry smile, and replied with, "No dogs, but there are Mangrove Men." He directed our attention to an old guy in the back of the bar and told us to ask him about them. My fisherman friend was quite tired from a full day out in the boat and decided to call it a night, and I had another drink alone before finally getting the courage to talk to the old man in the corner. The conversation that ensued was one of the most interesting ones I've ever had, and I will condense it into a few points. The prowler that we had witnessed the previous night was a Mangrove Man called a Junjure by local Aboriginal groups. In the past, they were present in the entire Moreton Bay region, but destruction of mangroves has resulted in them now inhabiting only 4 islands. They, or something very similar, also live in the mountain regions on the mainland. I am not sure if he was talking about Yowies. We know them in popular culture, 6 to 10 feet tall, or smaller creatures like the one I saw. They have not been known to harm humans, but are apparently quite mischievous, and the one near my ute was probably looking for fish or food. The Aboriginals do not consider them to be an animal or a spirit, but somewhere in between. They are well known to many of the locals in my area. Many have seen them, but many only believe them to be folklore. The old man I was speaking to had built up somewhat of a rapport with the Junjures, often leaving them food or toys, with their favorite toy apparently being squash balls. It was all quite a shock to me. The fact that these things were living in areas close to the largest city in Queensland just seemed ridiculous, but I cannot just ignore what I saw. My friend's charter business is doing quite well these days, and I try to have a fish with him at least 3 or 4 times a year, but we have only spoken about that night once since it happened. He has never told another person about it, for fear of sounding like he is insane, which is totally understandable. I have returned to the island many times since, but have not seen anything else out of the ordinary, and on my last trip in early 2014, I was informed that the old man I spoke to had passed away. I honestly can't help but feel incredibly privileged to have seen something that doesn't exist, and it really changed how I view a lot of things in life. This is the last story I have for you guys. A friend of mine runs an eel farm just north of Brisbane, and whenever I get the chance, I like to help him out. Now, the farming of eels is not a particularly difficult process when utilizing modern technology, but it is impossible to breed them in captivity. Their life cycle is actually quite amazing. All the freshwater eel species in Australia actually migrate tens of thousands of kilometers to the Coral Sea to breed, and then their eggs and larvae float back to mainland Australia on the ocean's currents. What this means is that all the farmed eels are caught as wild stock, generally collected in their larval form in sophisticated eel traps. However, my friend also offers an eel removal service, where he will remove mature eels from a water body for a fee. Normally, he will do this at golf courses or council-owned parks, but occasionally, he will do it for privately owned farm dams who are looking to remove eels in order to stock more edible species of fish, which is where this story begins. We were setting eel traps on a property in the Newmanba Valley, southeast Queensland. This is largely considered to be the westernmost geographical limit of freshwater eels in the region, as they rarely find a way to cross over the Great Dividing Range that runs up the East Australian coastline. This generally means that individual eels are few and far between in this area, but if conditions are suitable, you may get huge populations of very large eels in very small areas. These small areas are generally farm dams, miniature lakes that are built to supply water for small-scale agricultural processes. Because of the high amount of nutrients in the runoff from the agriculture, there is often large amounts of algal growth, resulting in populations of herbivorous fish and then eventually carnivorous fish, and in most cases, these carnivores are eels. The property that we were on was in an absolutely stunning area, nestled in a hidden valley between a few of the many unnamed hilltops in the area, with a creek running through the middle. We were camped in swags at the edge of the farm dam, and it was damn cold at night, often dropping into the low single digits. Not the most hospitable conditions, but great for trapping eels, as food sources are much scarcer in winter than they are in the warmer months. I have attached a mud map to this post, where the green represents the tree line at the base of the hills. The brown is relatively flat ground, with grasses and a few eucalypts. The darker blue is the farm dam, the lighter blue is the creek that feeds it, and the red X is where we were camped. The creek itself is only about 15 meters wide at its widest point, but more than 2.5 meters in some sections, which is quite a considerable depth for waterways in this area. We'd set the eel traps in the dam in the late afternoon, cooked some dinner on the fire after nightfall, and fell asleep around 9 p.m. I woke up at around 1 a.m. to answer a call of nature, haphazardly got dressed in my swag, and stumbled into the freezing night air. I walked about 50 meters from camp to a eucalypt tree, finished what I had to do, and just as I was about to walk back, it seemed like the whole top of the nearest hill was lit up with an incredible blue light. It seemed to almost swirl around this hill like a quick-moving mist, but it did not seem to be produced from anywhere in particular, nor was it actually illuminating anything in particular. Sounds funny, but it was just kind of there. I stood there for at least 2 minutes, watching it just sitting near the top of the hill before, almost mesmerized by it, before it slowly just faded away, and it was like never there. I was quite perplexed by this, and in the back of my mind, I was definitely thinking about the strange light I saw at the base of the falls in northern NSW, the first story I told, and truth be told, I was feeling very spooked. When I arrived back at the camp, my friend was wide awake, sitting up in his unzipped swag. I accidentally startled him pretty badly, as he thought I was still in my swag, and as soon as he calmed down, he said, "Did you see it?" I immediately thought he was talking about the blue light, and replied with yes, but I was quite taken aback when he then asked, "Did you see its face?" His story, as he told it, went like this. He was awakened by some disturbance, which was likely me getting out of my swag, and he lay there for a minute or two before deciding that he too needed to answer a call of nature. Just as he unzipped his swag and sat up, he saw somebody across the other side of the dam. He initially thought it might have been me checking the eel traps, and he was quite annoyed because they are supposed to be left undisturbed until the morning. He was about to yell out to me when the person he could see came into the moonlight. They walked to the farm dam in an odd manner. He said they seemed to push their chest out with each step in a pulse-like motion, bent down at the edge, and pulled in the eel trap by the rope. They then picked the trap up and started walking back towards the creek away from the dam. Now, at this point, he was beginning to think that it was someone who had traveled up the creek and was trying to poach his eels and traps, so he yelled out to them at the top of his lungs to, and I quote, "drop that shit." In a split second, the person dropped the trap, went down on its hands and knees, and turned directly towards my friend in a lizard-like motion, and the effect it had on him was incredible. He said it was almost like this thing's face was telescopic, and it jumped out at him from the other side of the dam. By this point in the story, he was beginning to sob, and I was telling him to stop talking and calm down a bit, but he continued with the story anyway. He seemed to be in serious shock. He was literally frozen with fear when the face jumped at him, and the creature then turned away towards the creek, where he described its movements to be very similar to that of a crocodile entering the water. A few interesting notes that I want to add. Again, I'm not an artist, but I have attempted to draw the face as he explained it to me. See the attached picture. I'm not sure if the red lines above the mouth are whiskers or another facial structure, and from memory, he was not sure either. I never heard him yell out to the creature, even though I was only about maybe 50 meters away from the camp. I think it's a fair assessment that the lights I saw and the creature that my friend saw were connected in some way. It was a new moon that night, so it was impossible for the creature to be illuminated by the moonlight, as my friend explained. The only explanation I can think of is that the lights I saw somehow illuminated it. At sunrise, the eel trap was out of the water, on the ground between the farm dam and the creek, but I did not find any footprints or marks all around it, despite the ground being a soft clay. To me personally, this adds credence to my friend's story, because if he moved the trap and faked serious shock in order to make up a scary story to tell me, then his footprints would be undoubtedly around the trap. I sat with him for the rest of the night, and he calmed down a bit, and we left about an hour after first light. I gathered up the eel traps, but released the eels, as I did not have the knowledge of how to store or transport them in the tank on a friend's truck, and he just wanted to get off of the property as quickly as possible. I did not tell him about the lights that I saw, and he never asked why I answered yes to the first question if I didn't see the creature. I still go out and collect eels with him occasionally, but he will not talk about what happened that night at all. I did speak to an Aboriginal auntie, female elder, whose family has lived in the area for literally thousands of years, and she basically just went, yeah, Bunyip, completely nonchalantly, as if what I experienced was an everyday occurrence. I did not want to press her too hard for information, but basically, they are similar to Junjures, which his tribe called Julagars, in that they are an animal/spirit hybrid. However, these bunyips are much more malevolent, and if given the chance, will drag you into the water and down into a spirit world where they live. To be taken with a grain of salt perhaps, but still very interesting all the same. Well, X, they are my stories. Like I said at the beginning, I don't expect you to believe them. Most people don't. I do hope you enjoyed them though, and if you have any questions, then feel free to ask. I have a couple other anecdotal things that have happened to me over the years that I might type out either tonight or some other time. Lastly, I'd just like to apologize for any grammar and spelling errors. I did double check, but it's likely that a couple may have slipped through. I'd also like to apologize for the spelling of the Aboriginal words. I basically spelled them phonetically, as I had never seen them actually written down. My story happened when I was on Year 10 camp. I was out in central Australia, about 1 hour's drive away from Kings Canyon, helping some Aboriginal tribe fix up their school grounds and their prospective new tourism business. Our campsite was about a 10-minute walk from the houses and of the tribe's people, and we were about 500 to 1 kilometer away from large rocks/cliffs. It was all pretty cool actually. They showed us their ancestors' paintings embedded into the rock face. Anyway, on the 3rd or 4th night, half the boys are just chilling with the camp leaders, and the tribe elder and some other tribe member comes up and pulls the camp leaders aside. We eavesdrop as teenagers do, and we watched intently. The tribe member looked somewhat shaken up. The elder just dead stared our camp leader in the eyes and said, "Get your boys to bed." At first, we thought it was because we were being too loud, and it was too late. However, we had been louder, and later at night. Furthermore, the houses were just around the limit of shouting distance. I doubt we were heard that well. Anyway, the camp leader looked at us and said, "You heard him. Get ready for bed." And the 5 of us just kinda strolled off hesitantly in different directions. However, one of us stayed behind, packing away the guitar. What we heard was that the tribe elder was visited by the Mountain Men, and that they come down sometimes to harass the tribe. Normally non-threatening, this night, they went to the elder and said, "We want your women and your food." Furthermore, the elder said no, and pissed the Mountain Men off even more. I'm hazy about the rest of the details, but we thought it was funny. Looking back, I believe the reaction of the tribe elder and the member were genuine. However, I also, to perpetuate a negative stereotype, believe they had a bit too much of something, if you know what I mean. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed the stories. The goal for the channel is 100k, so please subscribe, like, and leave a comment, because it really helps the channel. Thank you for watching.